David Yetman. Welcome to the lecture series sponsored by the Southwest Center and the Learning Curve Adult Education. Today we have a lecture that is given by my friend and colleague Robin Reineke, who is a forensic anthropologist. I must note that we are still in the time of the COVID pandemic, but my colleague and friend and culinary expert Janos Wilder and I are at least 6 feet apart. So Janos, let's take off the mask.
Okay, let's do it.
Oh, now we can talk.
Oh, you look even more handsome than you looked last week.
Yeah, well, flattery will get you everywhere, particularly if I get some of this food.
Okay.
Robin's work involves working with people from a number of different nations. And Janos, you have a special nation that you have spoken with Robin about, and you're going to present us a culinary example of where?
This is from Guatemala.
Guatemala.
So the dish is called fiambre. And it's a celebration dish that's made one time of the year, which is Dia de los Muertos, which is going to be just a couple of days from now, celebrated here in Tucson and all over the world. And it's a dish that's brought out when you remember the dead, when you remember your family that's no longer with you, when you remember the migrants who didn't survive as they went across the desert. And that's where Robin really works. And that's what she'll be lecturing about. So we thought it was super appropriate, particularly this being Dia de los Muertos, to sort of do a dish that remembers those that have passed and the wonderful memories that we have, but the sadness we carry as well.
Several different countries have different dishes that commemorate the Day of the Dead, so this seems very appropriate.
So this is a dish that has a lot of wonderful ingredients in it, and it's a cold salad, and so this is a salami and a chorizo that brought all the way from Spain. These are some of the best chorizo in the world. So we're going to garnish with that. We roasted a chicken. We're going to garnish with some of the chicken, ham, hard-boiled eggs. This is queso Oaxaca. So we shred. So queso Oaxaca, it comes in a lot of different forms. It just means it's a super fresh cow's milk cheese, but not crumbly. But so it's aged just a little bit to give it firmness. Like some of the mozzarellas that you see. Sometimes it's wrapped and formed in braids, and sometimes it's a string cheese. So this we just pulled off and shredded, pulled the strings off.
I think if you want a Oaxaca, you can probably buy a 50-pound glob of it too.
Yeah, you sure can. Some cornichons, some little pickles. These are sweet pickles, capers, so a little bit of sourness, radishes for some bitterness, and heirloom tomatoes, which we'll use. These items over here have all been pickled. These are potatoes and beets and green beans, and all of them marinated overnight in a caldillo. You can get the recipes for this from me on the website. But it's caldillo, usually you think about as a hot stew or a hot soup. In this case, it's a completely different meating. It's a cold marinade, really akin to an escabeche. It would be translate, I don't know, not literally, but it would be in Mexico, in that sort of cooking, it would be an escabeche. So we're just pickling these things, but lightly, just overnight.
They call it fiambre.
The whole dish is called fiambre, Fiambre. Mm-hmm. So we're going to build this. So we're going to start. This is our Day of the Dead platter.
That's the perfect platter.
So we're going to start and mount these things all around the shredded cabbage. I think that'll do it. And now I think I want to put these green beans. These are beautiful, and put these.
Those have been marinated.
These have been marinated overnight. So to do that, we actually blanch. The term is called blanching. So we just quickly cook them in boiling salted water. In this case, maybe 3 minutes, just to bring out their colors and to soften them just a little bit. But they still have their snap. Just like that. So, but they're just cooked a little bit. So we'll do that one, and let's get this chicken into action here. So, I'm going to separate this breast. Don't worry, none of this chicken goes to waste. Ultimately, it gets used in stock, but there's a lot between here and there. But in this case, I'm going to take the breast, and I'm just going to slice it. And we're going to just lay these slices around. This is like, I don't know, the reference point is probably not the best, but it's sort of like you would make a chef's salad with every wonderful thing that you have in it. And so we've got the chicken there.
There's a lot of the old country in this, a lot of Spain, the sausages, the ham.
Sausage and the ham, so let's do that. So let's cut some of this chorizo. Oh my gosh.
Now that's Spanish chorizo?
Yeah, this is Spanish chorizos, and the pigs that have provided this chorizo were raised solely on a diet of acorns. They live around the oak trees and pasture around oak trees.
What are the ingredients in the Spanish chorizo?
So only 3 things. Paprika, Spanish paprika, garlic and salt. Some of them don't even have garlic in them. Okay, so let's now do some salami. Oh, look at this hard salami. Oh my God.
Yeah, that's enticing.
It is. And so the thing about this charcuterie and what makes these pigs so prized is the flavor of their fat and their meat. These are just, they're really...
So they basically get nothing to eat but those acorns.
Yeah, they're just spread on the acorn.
Years or however long it is before they're
harvested. They're eating acorns and walking in the most beautiful property, most beautiful land that you can imagine, and live this super leisurely life until they don't. Okay, so let's do some vegetables on here now. So let's get these potatoes. And so we're gonna take some of these beautiful tomatoes. A little salt on our tomatoes. A little cracked pepper.
Every ingredient you add increases the flow of saliva. It's getting overwhelming.
Yes, well, we want it to be enticing. You're not going to have any trouble eating this. So we'll put some ham around here.
It makes me look forward to Dia de los Muertos.
Yeah, well, I think there's lots of good reasons to look forward to Dia de los Muertos, and it's a celebration of life, isn't it?
It is.
It's a remembrance and a celebration of life, and so we do this and to honor everyone who's passed with the beautiful food that we're...
And it's a day of joy. It's not a day of lugubrious mourning. It is a celebration.
So some hard-cooked eggs.
The tower grows.
It does. I think I needed a bigger platter here. Okay, we're gonna put these little pickles on here, these little sweet pickles. And a little bit of fresh cucumber. Stick these in just like that next to the tomatoes. And now, we used to leave the beets for last. Put a little olive in here. You can feed a lot of people with this.
I was going to say, the more you put on, the greater number of people it will serve.
Yeah.
But this looks like a family or
It is. This is
a clan dish.
It's a 2-day process, so so everybody gets involved. Your family, your neighbors get involved in the preparation for this and putting it together. You know, there's all sorts of traditions in Guatemala about neighborhoods coming together and doing beautiful things like alfombras and at Easter, those beautiful carpet of flower petals.
Yes.
It's what an amazing place.
And it's interesting how different parts of the celebration are in Guatemala, Salvador, and Mexico. They have their own particular way of celebrating that does not really cross the border.
Yeah, it is, and I haven't been to all of those, but I have seen them in Guatemala, the Easter celebration. Oh my goodness, what a spectacle. All right. Great, radishes here, and then I want to make sure I'm not leaving anything out here.
How about the beets?
Now the beets. The beets are the last thing because they're going to get my gloves all red.
I see. It has to do with the powerful dye in the beets.
Yeah, and then we do that last so I don't spread it all over, get it on everything. Oh, I think that's good. I think that's good. I think that we've got enough to do 2 or 3 of these, actually, don't we?
Okay. All right.
Okay, we'll start with this one, though.
That's all right.
So this is the fiambre. This is a celebration of life dish only made at Dia de los Muertos in Guatemala. And so enjoy, and when you have this dish and when you think about it and you see this, think about everyone you love that you lost and how much they meant to you and how much you cherish them in your heart.
And Robin weaves this story into the very sad work that she does, documenting the deaths along the border.
It's such poignant work. Yeah. It's wonderful that she does that.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Carlos, and thank you everyone for joining me today. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. I prepared some slides. Okay. So thank you for organizing this, Carlos, and thank you to the Learning Curve. I know everyone has put a lot of work into this, and it's just one of those things with a pandemic reality that it forces us to get creative, but of course takes a lot of work sometimes. So grateful for everyone being creative. So I am in a moment of transition. Well, I'm in a kind of a year-long transitional phase in my career. I co-founded the Colibri Center for Human Rights, a local NGO here in Tucson. And then only recently, about a year and a half ago, I actually left to join the Southwest Center with more of a focus. And so I am enjoying the opportunity to think through some of the work and the activism and the forensic labor that I was a part of and that I witnessed. So Today is a new talk and a new way of thinking through some of that work, so I'm eager to hear from all of you. So just in opening, I really want to center ourselves with a moment of care and just acknowledging the lives that have been lost on the border, and acknowledging the position of grief and unresolved grief that so many families are in. This will be a political talk. I don't mean political in the sense of what's about to happen on November 3rd, but I do mean that grief is political. And so I'm going to be talking a lot about grief today. And I'd like to also extend an invitation for everyone in the weekend that's coming, and especially November 1st, November 2nd, All Souls Day, to think about those that we miss and mourn and love, and maybe to reflect on the ways in which our grief may or may not feel political. It may or may not feel like it's an engagement with broader social conversations that can sometimes be quite fraught and quite emotional. So I've also prepared today with just some offerings of different ways to think about grief and to think about political mourning. And I hope that those are received with the intention in which I share them, which is an invitation to think about our own grief with care and welcome. So by way of introduction, I am kind of an unusual fence sitter between the university and between applied practice. So this is a photo taken a couple of years ago by the Associated Press. I'm in the medical examiner's office in that photo, doing something that I spent a lot of time doing throughout the decade plus of my work to try to identify the dead on the border. I'm looking at some items that were found with someone who had died, looks like 2016, I think. So I'm holding a cell phone and some money, and it looks like maybe a belt buckle. And so I spent a lot of time looking at those objects, both as an attempt to try and find out who that unidentified person was among missing persons reports, but also as an act of care and respect, and always also as a creative academic. So I'm actually not a forensic anthropologist. I'm often introduced that way, and people think that I'm a forensic anthropologist, but I'm actually an anthropologist. More of my training is in sociocultural anthropology. But I came to work in the medical examiner's office as a graduate student volunteer, very interested in, could I be a medical anthropologist in a forensic setting? So for those of you familiar with medical anthropology, medical anthropologists are usually trained in sociocultural anthropology, so ethnography, oral history, participant observation, and they apply their skills in the clinical setting. So they might go and work in hospitals or clinics or labs, and it can be quite applied, and it can be quite theoretical. So I'm really more of a medical anthropologist who has been positioned in a forensic context for a really long time. So I have a lot of training in forensics, but I am not a forensic anthropologist. I have so much respect for what they do, but it's not what I do. And then another caveat about who I am and what I did. I was 24 years old in 2006 when I came to the borderlands to help work with the forensic anthropologist and see, is there anything useful that a cultural anthropologist could do in this setting? I quickly became kind of Pima County's in-house missing persons collector. I became a list keeper of sorts. I would talk with families all over the world and try to note down as much relevant detail as I could about their missing loved ones so that we could try to identify or find them among the unidentified dead. And I'll get into that process a little bit later. But of course, as a graduate student, a big piece of what you're supposed to do is research, not just trying to help people who are in a pretty horrible situation. So my research basically had to take a step back because I found myself morally and ethically in this situation where I would be on the phone with families, and the data that I was looking at about the dead was the same data that they were very desperately trying to reach. So my research, some research happened, but to make a very long, complicated story short, it turned into the Colibri Center for Human Rights. I felt an ethical mandate to attend to the fact that the families didn't have a clear place to go. They were calling all over the place to try to find information about missing loved ones, hundreds of unidentified remains on the border. I felt an ethical responsibility to help bridge that gap before I did any more research. So it's sort of where a cure or a problem solving mechanism became the priority more than continuing to investigate. So in 2013, the Colibri Center for Human Rights was formed. A couple of dear friends and I pulled together this small NGO. This is a photograph of two or three Colibri staff with many families of the missing in Oakland, California, at a family network meeting. This was taken several years ago. And Colibri is still very near and dear to my heart, and continuing this important work here along the border as we speak, dealing with a huge burden of responsibility and hundreds of calls from families looking for their loved ones who were last seen on the border, last seen crossing the border. So one of the first ideas about grief I'd like to introduce is the hummingbird, and some stories about the hummingbird from the Americas. So some of these stories might be familiar to you. The hummingbird, of course, is a New World creature, unique to the Americas, migrates thousands of miles. There are dozens of species of hummingbirds, and they have ferocious little metabolisms. And so if you've lived in this region long enough, you might have experienced, seeing a hummingbird down on the ground in the morning. They might look as though they're dead. And then if you give them a little sugar water, or if they get revived by the sun, they kind of come back to life. So in traditional indigenous American communities, the hummingbird actually had a pretty powerful symbolism of being a messenger between the living and the dead. Because of this ability to kind of go into the world of the dead, kind of go comatose and go back, and many other indigenous cosmological explanations for the hummingbird's strength and particular power. The Aztec god, I always have a hard time with this name, Huitzilopochtli, was the Aztec god of war. And there was this very, very powerful symbology around the hummingbird that comes from this special strength that the hummingbird has. So it is said that if you see a hummingbird, someone is trying to tell you something. Someone from the other side, someone from the world of the dead is trying to tell you something. So when we came to name Colibri Center for Human Rights, we chose the colibri as a symbol to honor this idea of a messenger, that we should always pay attention to the world of the dead, pay attention to what, in a way, the dead are trying to tell us, what we can learn from the dead. And that we are never far from the dead. We are constantly socially wound up in the past, and the present is inseparable from the past. We also named Colibri after the hummingbird because there was a man whose remains were found in 2013, and actually in his pocket, so he had died crossing the border near Ajo, and in his pocket, the medical examiners found a small dead hummingbird. And so I remember that, and I always remember that particular case. So when we came to name the center, that was what we chose. Okay, before getting into the missing and the dead on the border, and I really am specifically going to be talking about the families of the missing today and their work to search. But before I can do that responsibly, I need to go through a little bit of history of how we came to where we are, which is tragically hundreds of deaths, very likely thousands each year in the deserts of the United States. So I'm going to just touch briefly on 4 chapters of this history that are particularly, that make it really visible how the border has been built and constructed as a labor control mechanism. So of course, borders are not existing in nature. They are not only formed through political and nation building practices, but the way that borders come to become real, the way that borders are used, the way that borders are experienced is also socially constructed. So these years, 1924, 54, 65, and 94, I'm sure some of you already see some of those years and recognize certain big immigration changes that happened in those times. But the particular theme that I want to draw your attention to is the inconsistencies around who can cross the border and when, and what can cross the border, and the inconsistencies where labor is treated in one way, whereas markets, commerce, and the flow of goods treated in another way. And that's a theme that we can see in the borderlands, the history of the border through these episodes. So 1924 was the Johnson-Reed Act, also known as the National Origins Act. And it's important to understand the, the cultural context in which this law came to be. So 1920s eugenics was really dominating politics and science at that time. So the idea that there was a national responsibility around protecting whiteness or certain forms of racial purity, that was a big piece of immigration policy in the 1920s. So the Johnson-Reed Act was really predicated on a eugenic idea, which is that undesirables would not be let into the country, but people from more desirable nations or people with quote unquote more desirable races were invited in. So the Johnson-Reed Act created numerical quotas by country. In addition, so it was uneven. So more people were allowed from Europe, fewer people from Latin America, for example. It also the Johnson-Reed Act also established practices on the border that really filtered who was allowed in and who was allowed in more easily and who had to kind of go through a layered border, if you will. So at the time, physical line inspections were required for Latin Americans and Mexicans trying to come through, whereas they were not for Europeans for a long time after this point. So many skipped the process of line inspection. Many Mexicans at that point skipped the process and came across the border, and that was kind of when we started to see the first idea of illegal aliens was around this time. I'm putting that in quotes, of course, really offensive language. So it's important to note that 1924 was also when the Border Patrol was founded. So it was really at this time that you see the border becoming a big deal in terms of who could cross, who couldn't, and what the consequences might be for those who crossed without official sanction. Interestingly, Border Patrol was founded under the Department of Labor. So that's a pretty big clue as to what the Border Patrol was invented to do. So the Bracero era, I won't get into this extensively, but it is important to note that the Bracero era from 1942 to 65, this is when hundreds of thousands of workers were invited. It was a war era, labor demand was very high. Labor from Mexico was brought in through a guest worker program. And by 1964, more than 4.5 million Mexicans had participated. And so the program had certain protections for workers, certain wage protections and treatment protections by growers. Primarily, these workers were coming to work in agribusiness. But long story short, the growers found it much more appealing to hire people outside of the bracero program because they had fewer protections. So even though there was this guest worker program, at the same time, the big growers and the big agricultural industry was really interested in hiring. This was when the language of wetbacks, another offensive language, but this is when that language became prominent. And what that term referred to were people that were not braceros, people who did not go through that process, but that were easier to exploit, and there were fewer protections around them as workers. So again, brushing over a pretty major history there, but an important one for what we're talking about now. So 1954, this is a pretty serious episode in American history that's not well remembered or discussed, but basically in 1954, Congress caved to pressure from growers to hire, to basically remove bracero workers and to be able to recruit workers outside of the bracero program. So even Border Patrol agents at that time were actively recruiting undocumented migrants to fulfill labor shortages in the agricultural sector. So that was happening in 1954. In the same year, so in the same year that growers are demanding to be able to hire people outside of bracero program, later on, it was in May of 1954, INS announced the start of Operation Wetback, where they would basically sweep up anybody, braceros and non-bracero workers, into a huge deportation operation. Estimated 2.9 million migrant laborers were forcibly removed from the US in a very illegal state operation, forced removal. Many Mexican Americans who were not immigrants at all, but had grown up in the United States and had been born in the US were also swept up into Operation Wetback. So in this one year, you see some of the patterns that become even more obvious in later years. There's a demand for workers and importing of workers, and then very violent and often illegal and disruptive deporting of those same workers. So 1965 is another really important chapter in this history. This is a photograph of President Lyndon Johnson signing the Hart-Keller Immigration and Nationality Act. So what Hart-Keller did, it was touted as this very progressive anti-racist law, and it was designed to eliminate that racist hierarchy that was established in 1924 by establishing even flat quotas for everybody across the whole world. So it didn't matter where you were coming from, there was a flat cap of 20,000, and that was the quota system. So no one country could send more than 20,000. Now that was ostensibly fair, right? But of course there's a difference between equity and equality. And what happened was, the reality was that, you know, through bracero and other means of immigration, there were an estimated 250,000 Mexican laborers in the US at that time. So if you can imagine, that was the approximating closer the demand of labor from Mexico, and Hart-Keller basically dropped that quota to 20,000. So this is one of the most important policy chapters where we understand how it is that we came up in the United States with this huge category of people known as the undocumented. Hart-Keller almost overnight transformed a massive sector of the population into undocumented workers because it dropped that quota so low, down to 20,000. So basically, it created conditions where if you were going to come across the border, you could not come legally. Only 20,000 of that 250,000 could come, quote unquote, legally. So that was where basically 1960s through 1990s, a big movement, consistent and often annual movement of people across that border for labor. So this is where migration as a kind of circular annual tradition, people migrating north for to harvest crops and migrating south at the end of the season. Mid 60s through mid 90s is really where that became the labor flow across the border was normalized. So the next chapter, of course, 1994, and this is the one that's the most important in terms of looking at the lot. How did the loss of life come about? So you have this hundreds of thousands of workers coming to fill especially seasonal agricultural positions in the Southwest from a long time, but especially 1960s through 90s. What happens in 94, two important things in the same year: NAFTA and prevention through deterrence. So I'll address prevention through deterrence first. So those traditional crossing points where people were coming across to fulfill seasonal labor demands, San Diego, people running across the highway or kind of coming under a fence. It was very informal, very common, very known. There were coyotes, there were some risks, but it was the thing to do if you wanted to come for labor in the United States was just cross the border on these kind of like immigration is looking the other way kind of places. What happens with prevention through deterrence in 1994 is that basically those places become militarized and walled off. So the theory behind prevention through deterrence is simply increase the possible risks and costs of that crossing with the idea that with enough risk and cost, people would not try to cross in extra legal ways. So the traditional urban points of entry were more or less closed off, and that's when what was left open were wide expanses of desert, mountain, and sea. So NAFTA happening in the same year, once again, this is 94 is one of similar to 54 in this very, very dramatic, inconsistent logic of opening borders to the movement of goods and commerce and closing them to labor. So NAFTA, we now know, and there were economists at the time that predicted it, it did unleash people from their land. So it made it very, very difficult for Mexican farmers to survive beyond being able to grow corn for their families. They could no longer easily compete in the market, which had been flooded by subsidized U.S. corn and grain and beans. So again, I won't get too much into NAFTA, but that's just a brief history of how we got to where we are now. And I'm going to now narrow in on the cost. And I'm not talking about the economic cost, but of course the cost in terms of human lives. I need to update this graph. I created this graph with my friend and colleague, Dr. Daniel Martinez in sociology at the University of Arizona. So there have been over 3,000 deaths since 94. I'm sorry, over 3,000 deaths since the year 2000, just in Arizona. So the reason I included this graph is actually to kind of show you, if you look, so 94, I know this is small, 94 is right around here. And blue is California. So if you can appreciate that, you can recognize that first in the late 90s, the deaths went up in California. The deaths then, basically California was effectively walled off, might be the only region of the border where that's at all feasible. And you can see here, 2000, 2001, the red, of course, being Arizona, the deaths increased tenfold. So compared to, when you look at 1999 and you look at 2002, there's a tenfold increase in deaths. And these are people found in the deserts of southern Arizona. And of course, we don't know actually how many deaths occur. We know how many remains have been found. And these numbers come from the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner, which is the medical examiner's office that I've worked closely with for the last 10, 15 years. So in addition to recovered remains, and we know that people are dying in that landscape, the other tragedy that we don't, and when I say we, I mean people like me who are not migrants, have not experienced that border crossing, are not part of Latinx communities who are very aware of these tragedies and these losses. But depending on the public that you're looking at, we don't talk about disappearance on the border all that much. So it's a difficult phenomenon to estimate in terms of numbers, but certainly upwards of 5,000 people have disappeared in the last decade. It's difficult because there's various groups collecting this data. They're small and underfunded, so Colibri is one of them. Colibri has about 3,000 missing persons reports covering the decade, primarily back to 2000. There's other small groups who have different lists, and we've tried really hard to merge our lists, but it's easier said than done. The other reasons have to do with the initial poverty and vulnerability of the families, that they try really hard to report and they get turned away. You know, I don't know about you, but if I imagine, you know, calling several agencies and trying to report my loved one missing and being turned away, that maybe I wouldn't know where to go next. And so I think there's a lot of fragmentation of data, but there's also the families are turned away, and so there's loss of data too. So what I want to talk about today going forward is how perspectives on the missing and some of the discourse around families of the missing, and this is discourse within forensic science, within humanitarianism, within human rights, can actually serve to aid and abet the dominant lens that already kind of disappears these people. So at first, people who are crossing are disappeared by the killing power of the desert, which has been harnessed by the U.S. state as a strategy of control. So the U.S. federal government has decided that it's okay for people to die on the border, and that's baked into the policy. So at first, people trying to cross can be disappeared by that deadly desert, which has, you know, it's not just the killing power of the desert by itself, right? But it's been utilized against those who would cross. But then because there's no body, and because the families are searching for a person whose status is ambiguous, there's another kind of layer of disappearance and erasure and some degree of dehumanization that can follow. But it's not a hopeless situation, and the families do a lot of work, and there are those who accompany them. So before going into some of the theory and some of my ethnographic work and some of what I've experienced working with these families, I would like to introduce one person in particular. This is Nancy Ganoza Cordoba. She's actually from Peru. Most of the people that I've searched for over the years and spoken with their families are Mexicanos, or maybe about 20 or 25% might be from Central America. Very few are from South America, but there are some. And Nancy disappeared in 2009, just south of Mission San Javier. She was trying to cross to join her daughters, who had been able to get status to come and live in New York, but she was really missing them and pretty depressed. So in 2009, she decided she would go ahead and try to cross to join them. And she disappeared along this road. So this is looking north along South Mission Road. Those of you who have been to Mission San Javier, this is maybe a 10-minute drive south of San Javier. She was in a van with a number of other migrants traveling north along South Mission Road at night, and they had crossed the border on foot, and then the van had picked them up after the walking portion and was driving them north. The van started to have mechanical problems, so the driver pulled off on the side of the road and was looking at the van and trying to figure out what was happening when Border Patrol came up behind the van. And Nancy was towards the front of the van, and the people who were sitting towards the front ran off into the desert, and the people who were in the back of the van actually got apprehended by Border Patrol. And we know all of this because of the work that the family did to interview people who were traveling with Nancy. And I'm using all of this with the family's permission. So this is just an example of the kind of missing persons report that I would get. And you can just see the amount of labor that the family has put in. So they're marking exactly, her scars and the little moles and details about her teeth and her hair. So they're really, documenting every little detail that they can about Nancy. And these are her two daughters, Karen on the left and Joanne on the right. And I spent a long time talking and getting to know them, especially Karen, who looks almost identical to her mom. Okay, so taking a step back just to introduce Nancy and Nancy's disappearance in 2002. So here's another idea or another offering about a way to think about grief. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the story of Antigone. So this is a Greek tragedy written by Sophocles on or before 441 BC. And so very, very briefly, the story of Antigone, this is in Thebes, and her two brothers, Polynices and I think it's Eotocles, basically start to battle. So they get into a war and they both their armies end up killing each other. So both of her brothers have died. Creon assumes power. So Creon becomes king of Thebes. And he declares that he's going to honor one of her brothers, but the other one shall not be publicly mourned. So he, does full military honors for Eotocles, and then he wants Polynices buried he actually wants him not buried. He wants him to just decompose in open and be preyed upon by the birds. And he declares that there will be no public mourning. Antigone, the sister of both men, refuses this law, and she is caught not once but twice trying to bury the remains of her brother Polynices. And she's caught, and in this painting, the servants of Creon have basically found her. She's laying a coin over her brother's chest, so in an act of mourning and care. And this is banned grief, banned mourning, banned care. So she's hauled into Creon's court, and to make a long story short, she's punished. Turns out that Creon's son is in love with Antigone. So when Antigone is sentenced to death, Creon's own son commits suicide. When Creon's wife finds out that her son has committed suicide, she commits suicide. So Creon ends up losing his own family because of this decree and because of how he punishes Antigone. So Antigone is a powerful symbol, a symbol that's been relied upon and used to kind of commemorate and think through the actions of families of the missing. And the story of Antigone is also, heavily discussed in philosophy to draw out the difference between the family and the state and the power of the family and kinship versus sovereign power. So there's a lot of philosophy and a lot of ink spilled about Antigone that I won't get into beyond one theorist, Judith Butler, who is a feminist scholar and political theorist who discusses Antigone at length. And in particular, what she discusses is the concept and the idea of banned grief and prohibited grief. And what does it mean when a person or a category of persons shall not be grieved or shall not be mourned or are ungrievable? So she's engaged with these questions, and I'm interested in how she discusses prohibition around grief. How does that come about? And how are they loosened? So how are prohibitions around grief loosened? So an example that Butler writes about, just to kind of ground us in something beyond the borderlands, is, for people who experience the violence of homophobia, if they have their lover dies, they can experience some degree of banished grief, that their grief is not legitimate. Sometimes that they might feel that they have to grieve in private because their love was banned. So that's an example that Butler interrogates a lot and uses to think through which lives are considered grievable, which lives are considered expendable, which lives can be sacrificed for the good of society, for the protection of others. And so for those who've been defined as outside of society, so as criminal or dangerous, Butler writes, quote, "Dehumanization emerges at the limits of discursive life, limits established through prohibition and foreclosure. And this prohibition and foreclosure exists particularly around definitions of which lives are grievable and which can be sacrificed in the name of safety or security of others." So thinking about Creon, there will be no public act of grieving. Antigone's grief at first was private. So she was just trying to care for her brother. She was not doing some big performative exhibit of grief. She was just trying to care for her brother in private. And that private act was disrupted and brought into a very public forum, into Creon's court. But she states several times in that interaction with Creon and in that kind of trial, yes, I did it and I would do it again. And her sister tries to say, no, I did it too. And Antigone says, no, I did it. And claims that act of grief as her own repeatedly and refuses to hide it and refuses to share that responsibility for that act with anyone else. So the story of Antigone and Creon and the way that Butler approaches it helps us to think through the ways in which the state creates conditions for disappearance, conditions for anonymity, conditions for the ways in which the state can create unknowable bodies or people who are disappeared, people who are exiled not only in life from the human community, but also in death. So the way that I'm looking at Antigone and Judith Butler's ideas are, how is it that families of the missing and families of those who have died on the border, how do they navigate a context where their grief has been, if not banned, certainly challenged? And what I've witnessed on the border and what I've experienced, and the reason there's all these projects like Colibri, is because the families of the missing are denied opportunities to find out what happened to their loved ones through a variety of means. When they try to call police, they're turned away and they're told, actually Nancy's daughter, Karen, when she called police turned her away and said, in order for us to search for a missing loved one or a missing person, they must have a social security number. And Nancy, of course, did not. So this happens all the time, that families will call the authorities in the US and be turned away. There's also some pretty horrifying practices on the border in terms of how the bodies are investigated. Really, buried with very little investigation, very little evidence collection. Thankfully, in Southern Arizona, we have a medical examiner's office that documents the dead carefully and rigorously, no matter the context. But there are jurisdictions across the border, right now in Texas, there's some really problematic treatment of the remains of the dead, which really extinguish hope in the future that the families can find out what happened. And if you have questions about exactly what that is, I can get into it later. But just to, summarize that there are multiple institutional, cultural, symbolic blockages between these families and their loved ones, preventing them from finding out what happened and being able to mourn in a traditional and private sense. There's also a silence around the deaths and a silence around the disappearances in popular media and dominant discourse in the US. So I feel like I'm kind of seeing this again right now. There's an effort locally to remind the public that people are dying on the border and this continues. And sadly, in the fiscal year that just ended, October 1st, the deaths are significantly up. So Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner has examined a significantly higher number of remains than they did last year. So we're trying again, and I say we, meaning this public that has gathered with concern around the loss of life on the border, we're trying to raise awareness about what's happening. And we're using the numbers again. So usually when we talk about the dead with concern, usually it's numbers that we are focused on. That's kind of where we're at in terms of talking about the crisis on the border. I think we talk about it in terms of numbers, and that's part of the silence and failure of recognition that I think relegates families and relegates us to a place prior to grieving and prior to mourning. And this silence, in the words of Butler, is a failure of recognition, which is mandated through an identification with those who identify with the perpetrators of that violence. So it's convenient to remain silent. Certain kinds of silences benefit certain kinds of discourses. And so to transgress a law or a ban against grieving is to position one's melancholy as perpetual or unresolvable, to make a grievance as well as grief. So if you are able to do as Antigone did, especially in the court, she's not only grieving, not only mourning, but she's also making a grievance, and she's refusing this edict that places her brother outside the realm of those bodies that can receive care and that can be included in the community of the living. So just one final quote from Butler that I appreciate and I want to share with you. Many people think that grief is privatizing, that it returns us to a solitary situation and is, in that sense, depoliticizing. But I think it furnishes a sense of political community of a complex order. And it does this, first of all, by bringing to the fore the relational ties that have implications for theorizing the fundamental dependency and ethical responsibility. So mourning and grieving is already always political. And if you think about the last funeral that you were at, how important it is to come together socially and to recognize that person as a social being, to tell stories about them, to hear what other people remember about them. Mourning and grief are highly social and always political. Again, not political in terms of political parties, but political in terms of signification and the politics of life and the boundaries around the social. So there's a big literature about the politics of grief and where and when and in what circumstances grief becomes very highly political and fraught. This is a photo, of course, of Madres de la Plaza del Mayo in Argentina. So this is a very, very famous example of families, mothers in particular, stating a grievance about their missing children. So they were demanding, and with this sign, they're demanding that their children be returned with life. They wanted their disappeared children to be returned to them, and they wanted the perpetrators to be prosecuted. So this is in Argentina, after, well, at the tail end and after the military regime that ended in the early 80s. But what does it mean to make your grief a grievance, or to politically grieve, to politically demand around your missing or sacrificed loved ones, if you are already denied legitimate membership in the state? So the families that I've worked with, most of them are undocumented. Most of them, I came to recognize the sound of fear and anxiety as they were calling the medical examiner's office to ask for information, because there's a risk. And indeed, families who have reported to the police and Border Patrol have been threatened with deportation or threatened with legal investigation simply for coming forward to request information about a missing loved one. So it looks different, the leveraging of a grievance in this context. It looks different from what it looked like in Argentina. In Argentina, this is one example, there was a very public, very highly visible, collective action. The madres would gather at this plaza, I believe it was every day at noon. They would wear white handkerchiefs and they would circle holding photographs of their loved ones. What's happening here, as the families not only demand information about their missing loved one, but demand that they have a right to that information and that their loved one should not and cannot remain missing, but must be named and must be attended to as an individual person. that grievance, in my experience, it is happening in a way that's not only personal, but also political. So it's not just this, a lot of the literature frames families of the missing as kind of almost crazily searching for information about their loved ones, that they can't sleep at night, that they're just completely distraught and made ill by the disappearance, to the point where they're almost incapacitated. This is how a lot of the literature talks about families of the missing. In my experience and in talking with these families, for sure, the experience of disappearance can wreck you. It's horrible. It's loss of sleep, loss of appetite, very, very difficult to carry on doing daily activities while you know that your daughter could be out in the desert somewhere, lost, being hurt. Very difficult to accept one's death without some kind of proof and social recognition. So I don't take issue with that. What I take issue with is framing the search as only personal, as only this, I need to know what happened to my loved one. Yes, it's personal, but it's also political. It's also a demand of the state. And in this case, a very brave demand of a state that has the power to deport you. So what I've experienced and been a part of is being on the receiving end of families calling and emailing and showing up and demanding information about their loved ones. And so the grievance in this case on the part of the families, it's not directed as much publicly and to the media and to the cameras and to the national public, but it's really focused towards forensic experts and bureaucrats and people who have any access point to data about the missing and the dead. Right, so some of the language in the literature, just to give you a sense, it discusses families of the missing as half dead or living in between life and death, suspended, frozen in time, locked in an endless ambiguity. That's just to give you a sense of how the literature really, not just on the border, there hasn't really been very much research about the missing on the border, but in other contexts, usually the experience of families who have a missing person is set aside as a separate thing from families who grieve or mourn. Yes, they're very different things. To have a missing person and to have a confirmed dead person is a very, very different thing. But there's a lot that's been written on the politics of mourning and the politics of grief that also apply to the pursuit of information and justice on the part of the families. So one of the first ways that I see this labor of making a grievance is just through the, not only the filing of missing persons reports, but the constant poking or prodding or reminding. So I would show up to my office at the medical examiner's office, a graduate student volunteer. In the little windowless office, there would almost every day be blinking red on my answering machine, indicating that the voicemails were full. And a lot of times it was the same families, and they were calling back to remind me and to say that person's name again, to put that photo on my desk, to make visible their loved one in any way that they could over and over and over again. On the forensic side, you know, my colleagues and friends in the medical examiner's office would kind of come to know these particular people through by name or by image. We would be talking about them, you know, on a first name basis. There are certain reports that really stand out, and it's, you know, where families have made them stand out and made them visible and refused to kind of let you have a moment's peace until you have addressed where their son is. So it's this kind of political action that I'm talking about. Of course, it's also I just need to know where my kid is. Of course it is that. And it is also a demand on the part of government officials to respond. So just taking a step back, this is the work and the action on the part of the families, of course, is not only happening in the filing of missing persons reports and the contacting over and over again of forensic bureaucrats, but it's happening in other ways as well. And just to think through the idea of public and what is public, Bruno Latour, a science and technology theorist, argues that maybe instead of thinking of a public, that we think of certain publics or assemblages that gather around issues or objects of shared concern. So the public that I'm really looking at and that I've really experienced is that of forensic scientists and humanitarians on the border who receive the grievance from the families and then often take it on as their own. We are changed. I have been changed by the families. I have been pushed and taught, and part of, my very early part of my story where I said, when research can't only be research. Well, partially because the families really wouldn't let me. They were making demands. They could see what I could see, that, oh, I had access to all of this data. And so they were really pushing me to respond and to fill my ethical duty to look, to search, to become a part of that search for truth and justice. So these are just some of the other contexts and publics that families have been able to draw together around their concern of a missing loved one. This is Karen Flores, who I introduced at the beginning, whose mother, Nancy, disappeared in 2009, and we were speaking together at the UN. This is in 2018, I believe. Nancy missing and Karen remembering her. A family here at the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights. The forensic public that the families have really brought as an assembly around their concern responded, and we organized a hearing before the Organization of American States, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and families spoke at that. This photograph is the relative of a young man posting his photo at a small altar where DNA was being collected by Colibri of many families. And so families were invited if they wanted to place the photo of their missing loved one on this altar. And then Camarina Santa Cruz, I don't know if anyone got to see the Netflix series that recently came out on immigration. I think it's called Immigration Nation. Anyway, Camarina's story is there, but she traveled to the border and spoke at a protest about her son. And Camarina actually found out the next day that we were able to identify her son. So she's speaking here still as he's missing. And then actually the next day we got news through DNA that her son's remains had been found and identified. So just to give you a sense of what do these publics look like, and this is one of the things that I am starting to think about more and talk about more, is the longer that I worked with families of the missing, the more that I saw this assembly emerge around their concern. So on the left, this is members of the Forensic Border Coalition. This is Roxana Altholz, a human rights lawyer. There's forensic experts, Mimi Duretti, very famous member of the Argentine Forensic Anthropology team, MacArthur Genius Award winner. There's families, Eddie Canales from South Texas Human Rights Center, and we're preparing and prepping alongside families to bring a case before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights that the U.S. federal government needed to respond in terms of helping the families have access to these databases. Anyway, it's a long technical story, but this is our forum and our hearing before the Inter-American Commission. This is Roxana, the human rights lawyer, holding photographs for Irma, whose 2 children disappeared crossing together in 1998. And this photo to me symbolizes really what I'm trying to talk about is, Roxana's holding the photos, Irma's speaking. There's a connection and an affection and a shared role that's happening there. So I think part of what's happening with families who are undocumented or experiencing some kind of exile by being labeled a status of either undocumented or migrant or something else, that they are strategically bringing in others to carry forward their grievance. So Roxana very literally holding the photographs of Irma's children. Mercedes Duretti on the right, speaking from her experience, Argentina, one of the leading human rights investigation organizations in the world, also there side by side with the families, presenting a grievance together with them. This is Families that could not be present at the hearing sent photographs and asked for those photographs to be held. So every single one of these photographs, these are not random photos that Colibri or somebody put together, but these were families that asked their photos to be carried by other families or by other participants of that hearing. I'm almost done, and I just want to close with introducing some border residents that you may or may not know about, depending, I think probably most of you are here in Tucson, so I'd like to introduce you to some of the other members of some of these overlapping publics that have been called into being as social actors by the families. So this is Mike Wilson, a friend of mine and a humanitarian Tohono O'odham man, who puts water out in the desert on his own as a daily or weekly practice. David Garcia, who has also been an outspoken critic of the wall, not only that it harms O'odham culture and traditions and lifestyle, but that it harms indigenous people from the South. The Reverend Allison Harrington, of course, at Southside Presbyterian, the current Reverend there, and then Reverend John Fife on the right, who of course became very famous during the sanctuary movement in the 1980s, arguing for and acting upon the belief that refugees, asylees from Central America should be given sanctuary inside the space of the church. So I'm actually introducing people to you who were called together by Nancy's family, Karen and Joanna, and I'll get to that in a moment. Margot Cowan, many of you probably know Margot, Pima County attorney. She's now leading a part of an important movement, Keep Tucson Together, longtime organizer and attorney here in Tucson. My mentor, Dr. Bruce Anderson, forensic anthropologist at the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner. And on the left here, the person bending down over the feet is Sarah Roberts. I don't know the name of this gentleman who his feet are hurt from trying to cross in desert conditions. This is Sebastian Kanak, formerly of the AFSC. He now works at the Guatemalan consulate. On the right, Alvaro Enciso, an artist who plants crosses at the GPS locations where people have died. So pausing to update you about Nancy. So shortly after Karen spoke at the UN about her mother, this is Nancy Ganosa, who disappeared in 2009 near Mission San Javier. Nancy was identified through DNA just not very long after Karen spoke at the UN. She had disappeared in 2009, but remains had actually been found in 2011, and they were never associated until 2018 because nobody took a missing persons report from that family. All of the official agencies who the family approached, and this family approached a lot, and they traveled and they were not afraid and they spoke English. They were turned away by multiple agencies. If any one of them had bothered to take a missing persons report and collect DNA from that family, Karen and Joanna and their dad could have had information about Nancy as early as 2012. What it took was the families to basically push until an organization was founded, which was Colibri. Then Colibri had to beg for money. That was my job, begging for money for a really long time, until we could fundraise to the point where we could equitably and fairly offer a DNA program. I myself collected the DNA from Karen and Joanna in New York. This is my colleague Mirsa collecting DNA from another person. Collecting a little buccal swab, that went into a kit, it was sent to a lab, and it matched very shortly thereafter to a cranium found in 2011. When I notified Karen and Joanna of their mother's identification, this is, years of searching, years of not being able to even talk about or easily remember Nancy because of the feelings of guilt and ambiguity and pain that it brought up. Karen called back shortly after the notification. I did it by phone, which is a hard thing, but we don't have the funding to go in person, and families usually they've asked us to notify them as soon as we know anything. So we call and ask them to prepare themselves, and then we call back and we do notifications over the phone, or at least we did when I was with Colibri. I'm still speaking in the present, but I don't do this work anymore. Karen called back and she said that they wanted to come to Tucson and they wanted to do several things. And one of the most important things they wanted to do was to plant a cross and bless the site where Nancy's remains had been found. They also wanted to search the area for more bones because only a cranium had been found. And what you see here is exactly what I'm trying to talk about, which is what happens when these families call us into being and call us into grief and call us into community. So here on the left, this is Reverend John Fife, Allison Harrington. I can't remember the name of the priest, but a Catholic priest. This is Joanna Esteban, Nancy's former husband, and Karen. This is Sarah Roberts. So Sarah Roberts actually knew Karen and her father because when they had come out and tried to search, Sarah helped them search the desert. So she was able to be there almost 10 years later, finally, when they found Nancy. This is David Garcia of Tohono O'odham Nation, blessing the family. So each of the clergy in turn blessed the family and blessed the place where Nancy's remains were found. And we all stood in community. There's Alvaro Enciso. So Alvaro was there and planted a cross. Nancy's favorite color was purple, so the family selected purple. This is Karen placing a photograph of her mother glued onto the cross. And we each, everyone in around the circle placed stones. We all selected rocks from the area and placed stones at the foot of the cross. We did then a search. So Bruce Anderson, I don't have a photo of him here, but Bruce Anderson and the other forensic anthropologists helped organize a search. So they were out there that day with the family. This is Mike Wilson, who Mike and Karen really connected. And so Mike also helped us be able to do this because it was on Tohono O'odham land. So he brought David Garcia for an indigenous blessing and helped us with the tribal council to actually get permission to plant the cross. And of course, there's so many others in our community who do this kind of work who are not there that day. But just to remark on, sometimes we think that we're small, and actually if you pan out and you look at the scale of connections and the scale of the community that has been called into being around these losses, and the recognition of grief ultimately is a recognition of care and connection and community. Raquel Rubio Goldsmith and Barclay Goldsmith, of course, longtime local leaders. On the right photograph of No More Deaths, placing water in the desert. And down here, the Migrant Trail Walk that happens every year to commemorate the lives lost on the border. So thank you. I want to make sure to create space for questions. Go ahead and stop share.
Okay, thank you so much, Robin. As usual, I think we need a few minutes just to get ourselves together after listening to you and see your pictures. So please now, feel free to, I'm gonna allow you right now to unmute yourself. So if you wanna ask directly a question to Robin, just unmute yourself and ask. And if not, you can use the chat and I can read the question to her. So please feel free.
I see a couple of questions that were written to me. Was the Woody Guthrie song about the plane crash at Los Gatos Canyon written about the 1954 deportations? Oh, that's such a good question. It may well have been. I'm not sure. Does someone else know? There's a beautiful book about that plane crash at Los Gatos Canyon it's called All They Will Call You. I'll grab it. and I recommend it to learn more about that episode in history. And then another question, why was Yuma excluded in that graph? So Yuma County is a kind of a complicated gray area in terms of counting the loss of life on the border. And it's inconsistently, Yuma County officials inconsistently send remains to Pima County. They handle them themselves, or they send them to various federal agencies that have some kind of jurisdiction in Yuma County. So Yuma is weird, and it's been kind of a strange geography for documenting the deaths over the last 20 years or so. So that's another area where we can really see that the count, this focus on numbers really, it's never going to be complete. We're never going to have a complete count of how many people have died, how many people have disappeared in this geography. I'm of the mindset that it is important to count. It is important to do the best that we can, but it's no longer good enough to only fixate on the numbers, because the numbers are always going to be so problematic and so incomplete.
Robin, I would like to ask you, because being here in the context of the Southwest Center and the university and Tucson, I obviously, and as I learn more about this, I can feel like a lot of sensitivity about the issue. But in your experience, and because of the obvious political climate, how do you feel? It's like I'm kind of begging for a positive answer, but do you see kind of an increase in sensitivity towards these issues, or the political climate is just sending people to their extreme? And beyond that, what is there anything that we can do in terms of, I don't know, humanly convincing people of see the human perspective of this problem, rather than that they are getting our jobs kind of discourse?
Yeah, it's a big tough question. I mean, I do feel more, to be honest with you, strangely more hopeful about, I feel more hopeful about the national conversation about immigration right now than I did during the Obama years. And the reason is that there's been this awareness, the Trump administration's overt, very verbal, violent language, violent policies have really called into being a resistance that's more coherent. So during the Obama years, deportations were happening, of course, in unprecedented scale. The border wall was being heavily militarized. There were a lot of inhumane policies under the Obama administration, and there was a lot of fragmentation on the left in terms of how to address those issues, and also how to address the question of demanding rights and legal status for those who are already here. And I think that since the threat of the really fascist violence on the Trump administration, I think, we saw those signs that people were carrying, no wall, no ban. I had never seen anybody in a protest other than like a little leftist protest saying no wall. But now people are aware that this wall is causing real harm. It's really ugly, socially, environmentally, politically. It's not something we want. And I don't think that we haven't been as bold on the advocacy side as I think we are now. So I find a lot of reasons for hope, but this wall business it's dirty. It's really violent, and I'm hopeful that a broader coalition of actors are starting to see that that's the case, that this wall, it's wasteful, it's hurtful, it's symbolically violent, it's practically violent. So that's where I find hope right now. One of the places.
We'll take that as a positive answer. Thanks.
How many families have found resolution is a question. So that's a little bit of a tricky question to ask. I mean, not to ask, but to answer. Because so we can look at we can look at that question in one way, which is if you look at the total number of remains found and examined at the medical examiner's office over the last 20 years, that total number is, I think it's right around 3,300 right now, excuse me. And just over 2/3 of those dead have been identified and returned home to their families. That leaves about 1,100 or maybe now 1,200 people who are unidentified. So those are just, that's just one piece of the problem, right? Because we know, okay, we found 1,200 people who we don't know who they are right now, scientifically or affectively, but we don't really know how many people have not been found and how many families are searching above and beyond that 1,200. I think it's probably going to be in the tens of thousands, very, very likely, because of the vastness of the landscape. I mean, I'm just looking at Arizona numbers, and if you were to unfold the mountains of Arizona, you're already looking at a massive landscape that I think is bigger than the state of Texas. So it's a very complicated geography, and it's very complicated geography of families in terms of where they are, who they're trying to reach for help. There's families from Central America to Alaska. So I don't know how many families don't have resolution, but I know among the remains that have been found, how many of those have been identified. Colibri has been pretty successful. And they've been successful at more than just the identification work, but they've been successful in bringing families together, introducing families to one another. The families, you know, at first we thought, I'll be honest with you, we thought that by bringing families together that maybe we would be creating, helping the families to create like advocacy organizations. And we didn't understand that actually what the families wanted was basically a mutual aid group where they could share ideas with one another about what they were doing. They could support one another and offer spiritual or psychological resources. They could say, oh, you know, this guy at the consulate, don't call him, but call this guy over here. So that's what part of what Colibri has been doing, has been introducing families to one another so that they can become stronger as a collective. Colibri, question, Colibri, how is Colibri funded? It's funded through private donations. So I will beg you, if you are able to do that, find Colibri Center for Human Rights. I'll put the link in the chat. They need help always. They're in a particularly difficult year because so many people have died and disappeared this year, partially due to the Trump, hold on one second, I can't type in colibricenter.org. The Trump administration, since the pandemic emerged, it has created a policy where people are deported they're deported to Mexico very, very, very quickly. And they're not deported to regions that have any infrastructure. So basically, because of the pandemic, the administration is shortcutting all of these procedures that gave people access to asylum interviews and other mechanisms to be able to stay at least temporarily in the United States. Now people are being deported very quickly to places that have no infrastructure. And so we believe that part of the reason why there's such an uptick in deaths right now is because people are already tired. They've already gone through one attempt to cross and they've been apprehended. They're being deported, they're exhausted, and they're trying again right away. So Colibri is dealing with I think an average of 30 calls per week, and they have a staff of 4. So they really could use your help. And then someone also asked, can you tell us more about the Texas situation? So Texas situation is complicated and tragic. It's uneven. So just if you imagine, I don't know if you've seen a map of the counties in Texas. It's like this little, looks like a puzzle. There's just tiny little bricks of counties all along southern Texas. So the one problem is that there's such fragmentation of authority in southern Texas along the border, all these little tiny counties with different procedures. And everybody was sort of doing different things. And, you know, they might get 2 or 3 or 5 remains of migrants per year, not really know what to do with these cases. And the cases, the remains were sometimes really not being investigated. So that's one problem. Then there's also been problems that I think really can't be explained other than through indifference and racism and dehumanization, and where the remains of migrants were buried without examination. Some of my forensic anthropology friends have been involved in every single summer. They go to this one cemetery, Sacred Heart Cemetery in Falfurrias in Brooks County, Texas, way down in the point, the southern tip of Texas. Every year they exhume, you know, 100 or 60 or 70 more remains from that one cemetery where people were buried without markers, buried in the pathways in between other graves, buried in the around the flagpole or up against the side of the fence. And in the course of these investigations and exhumations, the forensic scientists found remains, you know, crania that had been put in a milk crate in plastic bags and buried with no coffin, maybe 10 centimeters or so under the soil. Remains where trash, like examining trash, like gloves and equipment had been thrown in with the remains and buried really disrespectfully. So it's a huge problem. And it's, you know, of course, there's this respect for the dead violation that you see in some of the practices in South Texas. And then on top of it, DNA was not collected. The records of, you know, where and when was this individual found. So the law enforcement records were disassociated with the material remains. So you have material remains that have been buried in the cemetery, and there were records taken by officials, and it's really difficult to tie together which skeleton matches which records and photographs and personal effects and all of that other evidence. So it's a really big mess. And thankfully, there is a bigger medical examiner's office in South Texas, which is centralizing some of the investigation and doing a lot of the investigation better. But that medical examiner treats the families very, very poorly. Really horrible stories from families about trying to contact that particular medical examiner's office and get aid. So it's kind of like in Texas, it has been, in my experience, it's like one problem we kind of maybe fix and then another one pops up. But it all comes back to this real, you know, state of exception that the families and their loved ones are placed in as people that unfortunately have been defined as criminals, defined as external from communities of care. And you can really see that unfortunately filtering into some of the practices by officials, not only in Texas, but also in Arizona. There's a county in Arizona that has been scattering the cremated ashes of the unidentified into the desert. That means that if and when there is an identification, the families will have nothing. There's a county in California where the remains are cremated and scattered at sea. Yuma County has some pretty serious problems in terms of how remains are investigated and the data is managed. So it's not just Texas.
Can you read? I have more questions here, Robin. I don't know if you can read them. Becky asks, what is needed to improve the identifications, federal legislation, register?
Oh yeah, I didn't see that question, thank you.
Yeah.
So I think the biggest thing is what we were advocating for at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. So I mentioned several times how families like Nancy's are turned away from law enforcement, or they are deeply afraid and intimidated to contact law enforcement because they're undocumented, or just logistically, they can't even, they're in Guatemala and they can't report in person, or they don't know exactly which police agency to go to. So that's one problem. There are a couple of federal systems that exist to centrally manage missing persons data and data about unidentified human remains. One of them is called NamUs, which is a cool system that basically archives circumstantial information about the missing and the unidentified. And it's a system that anybody can go and create a login, and kind of, you could look for a missing person, or you could look at records about one particular unidentified person and see if you want to try to be a cyber sleuth and figure out who that person might be among the missing. But it's also a pretty important system for forensic practitioners. When human remains are found, you can do a filtered search in NamUs and you can come up with dental records and descriptions from families. So that's NamUs. Then CODIS is a DNA version of that. So all of the DNA, ideally, the vision of CODIS, it's the FBI's central DNA repository, and there's a number of databases under CODIS. So there's like sex offenders and missing persons, and the databases are kept separate. Anyway, if you're a missing family of a missing person and you want to get your DNA into CODIS, which in theory would allow your DNA to be compared against any unidentified remains case found in the country, you must go through law enforcement. And if you don't report as a family to police, you do not get that access to the science and technology of DNA. So that's a huge problem. The Forensic Border Coalition that, I showed some pictures of us advocating for a change in this policy. We believe that if that policy were changed, probably hundreds of identifications would happen very, very quickly. The way that Colibri is able to get around this, so you saw that, okay, Colibri collected DNA from, I myself collected DNA from Nancy's daughters. That DNA went to a lab. We pay a private lab, and so it's much more expensive because we have to pay for the postmortem side, the antemortem, so the family reference DNA, and the comparison. It's an extremely expensive privatized option, which is not ideal. But after years of watching the families be denied access to this science and technology, I just decided, I was director of Colibri, and I decided that we would basically act as a private investigator for them, that they should have access to the exact same science and technology that I would have access to. And if we had to fundraise over $1 million to do it, then that's what we had to do.
So related to that, Robin, Laura is asking, how is Colibri funded?
Mostly private individual donations. It's been really hard. So large foundations as well, but the individual donor base for Colibri is really important because the issue is so political. Sadly, it's been politicized. So Colibri definitely depends on a family of supporters.
And I guess also kind of related to it's Lois says, just wanted to say thank you for informing us about Colibri and the humanitarian work it has been doing. As I learn more, I'm saddened by the existence of our country's policies. What can we do to help?
Thank you for that question. I think, and I would love to hear from others if you have different ideas. I am only an expert in one part of this, but I think we need to talk about it more and talk about the border and actually explicitly talk about people who do cross the border without documents, and have conversations with our friends and family about how far are we willing to sacrifice in the name of this highly constructed border law that I talked about. So I think that's the biggest thing to do, is just to have conversations with people and tell these stories and do our best to honor our responsibility as witnesses. So I think that's one big thing. we've seen in that kind of mini history that there's a lot of ways of approaching these issues, of there being a demand for laborers from Latin America and a surplus of laborers who are looking for work in the United States. There's other solutions than what we have right now. And what we have right now is, if you can make it across the border with your life, you can come and be employed under conditions of severe risk and exploitation. That's not sustainable. And I really hope that we can get into a conversation about trying something different on a policy level than what we've tried over and over and over again for the last 30 years, which is simply investing everything in more border security. We've tried that and we see the cost. So it's time to try something different.
Have you found a way, Robin, to communicate all this to kind of, average people? Because I get the feeling that, it seems so clear when you go back in history and you analyze like you have done today and see all this way to control labor. But I guess the reaction from people will be, I'm being lectured on things that I don't quite understand. Have you found a kind of a range of, level of speech in which people are more receptive to, understand without being, without being lecturing about history and, sociology and labor relations and international law, and just being, it's just a good thing to do, kind of thing?
Well, I think what's been helpful for me is just to be able to speak from my own experience, to be able to say, I know some of these people, and in my experience, this is not their first choice. It's kind of a last choice. And yeah, I mean, it's a really hard thing. These conversations are not easy. I think Surge, Showing Up for Racial Justice, is an organization that's doing a lot of work and training about how to have these kinds of conversations. I am not an expert there. That's definitely been hard. And I think one of the things that I witnessed that made me want to write this particular paper is, the experience of being in pre-pandemic times, sitting in a plane next to somebody, or actually my neighbor just very recently, introductions come around like, oh, what do you do? And when I would explain Colibri and introduce myself, the conversation would kind of stop and discomfort would happen. And people would kind of like, I'm at a cocktail party or networking event or whatever. And I would notice a discomfort and a silence when I would introduce my work, which I think gets back, there's this Judith Butler quote about what that is doing is silencing in a way that benefits the dominant discourse that places these people as ungrievable lives. So if we can't talk about them, we can't grieve them. And so I really do believe that talking about it and just engaging and asking awkward questions is really important.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think I don't see any new questions here, so I guess we can finish here. Again, thank you so much, Robin. I guess if you have, if all of us present today here, we can talk, tomorrow to 3 people, and apart from telling them go to vote, telling them a little bit about all this, maybe we are getting something here. So thanks so much, and good luck with with your fight.
Thank you. Be well, you all, and thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, everybody. See you next week.
Take care. Bye-bye.